Digital model.
Yeah, it's effective. And also, if you ask, I'll say this, when you ask about the PowerPoint, then when you listen to it, I'll send that to you later.
Yeah, my boss has just been I can't say either or, and he does probably knows.
Is it harder when they're home playing?
Yeah. Which is like, it's quite a difficult job, it makes more sense to work in generally.
One of my friends used to do the barns and palace and people's wives and people. You can hardly beat that because that's the same sort of thing. I mean, now you need to go and fill and stop and barns up the week before the match.
Okay, while we're waiting for this machine to wake up, sounds exciting. I just want to give kind of reminder about a point of information about dissertations for those who do the theory pathway. So the other pathways, image making, critical computing, this is not relevant, but for the theory pathway, the deadline I'll just show you for the So the deadline for a draft title for the theory pathway is the 4th of December. I think no, 2nd of December. Yeah, so we have a kind of structured pathway for this, or a structured set of milestones for this pathways. And what I'd like you to do is to email me a draft title by the 2nd of December. It's not something you're fixed to, it's not something you're kind of contractually obliged to carry out, but it's just a point of indication of where your work is going. And it would be good if you would arrange an appointment with me beforehand to have a discussion about it. Okay? So we'll have the main thing is to have a think about what your interests are, where you'd like to kind of focus your work over the course of the dissertation, and this is a kind of initial pointing towards that. Yeah? So the 2nd of December is the deadline for that. Okay, so this week we're looking at networks and the idea of the network as a key factor in contemporary ideas about digital media. So what the network is, what its history is, what versions of networks are significant. As you'll know from the Castells reading that you had, there are numerous different ideas of what a network is and what digital media is historically. And we can look at some of those differences and divergences in the seminar. But here in this lecture, we're going to look at what the network is, what different technical manifestations of networks are, why they're socially, politically, aesthetically significant in different ways, how they're seen as being kind of culturally active in different ways, and how they also have kind of different kinds of rhetoric, different kinds of ideas, different kinds of philosophical approaches both embedded in them and by which they're spoken about. So we're going to look at a number of different modes of the network. So the idea of the internet as one kind of network, but also how networks are created by different kinds of technology within digital media. So look at hyperlink and hypertext as a cultural form of network. Look at networks in social analysis, what's called sociometry, and think about how networks are seen to have some kind of sociological effect, and also allow us a kind of sociological understanding to cut into society in some ways. And then look at networks in more kind of mathematics approaches, or approaches derived from physics, in web science, data science, and network theory more broadly. Okay, has anyone seen this image before? Okay. This graph it's a diagram of 3 graphs of different kinds of network. It was made in 1964 by a telecommunications engineer, quite a young guy at that point, in his 20s, who was trying to analyse the best structure for a computer network, trying to understand the best structure for a computer network that could withstand damage. So the context was the development of the Cold War. As the two superpowers at that point increasingly ratcheted up tension between them in order to maintain each of them their kind of different imperial agendas. There was the need for, within the military, for a communications network that could survive, or as they saw it, survive a nuclear war. So this is one of the roots of the structure of the internet, is this need amongst military technologists for a system that would allow for command and control in the society, particularly in this case the USA, to survive the nuclear war that they were creating this kind of strategy around. So what Baran did, who was one of the researchers looking at the structure of the network that would best achieve its aim, was to think about different kinds of structure of network. So if you have a network that is highly centralized, which is this one, which everything goes through a central node, all your imaginary enemy or your actual enemy has to do is knock out the central node, and none of the other nodes can communicate. And so if you're targeting that network, this is the key point. And so if you think about many kinds of organizational structure, why the US is very excited about killing Baghdadi yesterday, for instance, is because they believe that ISIS consists of this kind of structure, a very centralized form of network or hierarchical form of organization. Here, this is a decentralized network, so it's a network that has multiple central points. So here in this version, you can see that the network is spread out more. This is a distributed network, which means that each node, which is each point, has roughly the same number of connections, and it can also make connections to any other node. This mode of network structure, this graph, was seen to be the most resistant to attack. It's something that could be established if 10 of these nodes were knocked out by an attack. They would still, the network as a whole, would root around this damage. Yeah? So the network is something that is able to go around damage to it. And we see this as something that is makes up a lot of the condition of contemporary information warfare or cyber warfare, in this ability for the internet to root around damage. So this schematic diagram argued for a decentralized, distributed form of network that was implemented in some of the early warning systems, out of which the internet grew, and became a basis for the development of a decentralized network that also decentralized the structure of the signals within it. So if you look at TCP/IP, for instance, and you look at the way that each message is broken down into several packets, this distribution is something that runs all the way through the structure of the network. So it's physically distributed, but it's also semantically distributed. In the packets can go via multiple routes. When you send an email, often the email will be broken down into several sub-messages called packets. These packets can go separately by several different routes, and they can be repeated if they're not sent successfully. So there's what's called a degree of redundancy in the network. That is not that the network makes people unemployed, but that the network has multiple possible routes from one place to another. So often you see this kind of slightly cheesy graphic describing what the network does. So this is where, obviously this is not an accurate graphic, but it's a kind of characteristic graphic of how the internet is represented. And you see that it's this distributed graph is spread across the world. Yeah, and so that it has this uncanny effect of taking a spatial distribution, that is the globe, and then mixing its topology. So things that are proximate in geographic terms may not be proximate in network terms, but the network brings things together that may not necessarily be physically close. So this ability of the network to knot things together through interlacing physical space with the topological space of the network. That is the kind of graph of the network that links things together. So this is one of the kind of ideas of networks that is fundamental to how they're interpreted culturally, in that they bring together on an equivalent descriptive diagram, something like this, and lace it into the physical world and the cultural world, the social world, and so on. So this basic idea of the network created a lot of opportunities for linking things together in many different ways. And one of the things alongside the kind of military development of the internet was the scientific development of the internet. So the internet, previously known as ARPANET, Advanced Research Projects Initiative, was something that, agency rather than initiative, was something that was funded heavily by the American state. So when we think about the internet as a space of entrepreneurship and libertarian kind of economic activity, we have to remember that this is the case, but it's also underwritten by vast amounts of state funding to get it off the ground and to develop it. And that state funding going through the kind of welfare supply to the military. And this, at the same time, was also something underwritten by a long-term interest of scientific information management systems. So what's known as hypertext now is something that emerges in the 1940s during the Second World War as an idea for scientists and technologists to be able to encounter vast amounts of information. So during these periods of particular kind of social crises, it was necessary for scientists to be able to cross-reference enormous amounts of material across fields. So the idea of hypertext as a set of documents that can be linked, can be searched, trails can be made from one kind of document to another, was something that was founded in this moment where it was necessary to work in a kind of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary manner. But hypertext as a reality, apart from a few custom systems such as Xanadu that was made in the 1970s, initiated in the 1970s by Ted Nelson, only really began to be operative in the mid-90s, or 1994 to around 96, when you had the first graphic browser, Mosaic. The hyperlink allowed for documents, that is texts in the early case, to be connected to each other. So you could link from one document to another in a way that had previously been impossible to do. So it's a way of making a large-scale document out of many small documents, or a way of, within one document, referring to another document. So you can imagine for people used to libraries, used to physical books, this was immensely exciting. So if you think, when you go and use the library in Goldsmiths and you read one book and you see it linked from that book through a footnote to another book, and you go and find that book if it's in the library and someone else is not reading it, and then you find another book from the footnotes in that book. You can see this is time consuming and it's laborious and possibly disappointing, and the document isn't there. What this allowed scientists to do was to communicate between texts extremely rapidly, almost instantaneously. So it started in CERN in Switzerland, the space for high energy physics. And because they were producing so many documents and working with so many documents, they really needed a way of integrating their document storage and ability to compare scientific papers. So what this allowed them to do was to make that ability to store documents in a decentralized manner, and to make connections between them. So this tag, most of you will be familiar with the anchor tag and the href function within that tag is the basic component of hypertext. So this, when you're looking at a website and you're looking at the markup, you'll see this as the basic equivalent to the links between nodes in Baran's diagram. So this idea of hypertext changed relationships to text, and text became something that wasn't simply a standalone document. It became a cluster of links to other documents, very much more palpably something that's embedded a relationship to other documents. And it also changed the idea of what reading was, and what doing research was, and people started to develop new ideas of what reading could be in this new futuristic moment of mid-1990s. So people started talking about the idea of surfing the web rather than kind of plan methodically through standardly organised documents. So surfing implied the ability to move with great elegance around fast-moving flows of information. So this idea of moving with skill, with knowledge, through vast swells and waves of information. So the idea of information as a space of flows, a space of moving, ever kind of active flows of data, derives from this era. And before search engines, in order to make sense of this, new kinds of documents were developed that allowed people to make, outside of links within documents. There were documents that simply consisted of links that were, say, lists of sites that would be useful for certain kinds of sources, online repositories that became lists of links, and the idea of cool sites, as sites that you'd be interested in simply because they were websites. Later arising from those were directories, such as Yahoo, which some of you will be familiar with as an existing search engine, which the name Yahoo stands for yet another hierarchically ordered ontology. That is something that is structured into categories. That's something that was seen to be antithetical to the web. But search engines originally, before Google and others took this network form as their basic principle through the PageRank algorithm and so on, were basically like encyclopedias, like standard reference books. But what was important is that as alongside these new cultural habits was the idea that the web itself, as something that was both text and code, text and markup language, communicative speech or scientific speech, and a structured form of network, was something that embedded two kinds of text simultaneously. So the network in this case was something that one could code, and HTML was, especially in early versions, was extremely easy to use and to pick up, so it spread very fast. So compared to other previous versions of hypertext, which were relatively complex in terms of their syntax, HTML from 1 through to 3 pretty much was something you could learn within a few hours. And it also, this idea of the hyperlink and the hypertext developed a new form of theory in order to understand it. So there was an idea that there was a new kind of text being developed. So often you'd have a number of writers and artists developing websites that use the idea of the link, and the link creating networks, mixing fragments together, creating a novel form of document was something that was highly interesting to many artists, especially once and writers. So especially once images were able to be incorporated into websites, this became a great field of activity. One of the early theorists of this was an American scholar, George Landau, who looked at the way in which hypertext, and he's referring specifically in '92 to pre-World Wide Web forms of hypertext, looking at the way that hypertext would allow for an inherently deconstructed form of text. So he took a lot of ideas from the literary scholar and philosopher Jacques Derrida, and looked at the way in which what was central to a text might also become a margin, and what is marginal might come to the centre. So it was an idea that all of the different aspects of a text might change their status, their prestige, their position as central to the text. So as the network form, as we remember back to the idea of the network as a spread graph, as it hit geography, it creates new kinds of proximities and distances, new kinds of topological space. As the network hits text, it also does the same to the idea of text. What is important? What is central in text? For instance, the difference between the author and the reader. If we have text that anyone can link to, does that mean that anyone is adding to those texts? What are the new forms of authorship that are produced in hypertext? What are the collaborative forms of authorship that we understand text to be? So some of the large-scale suggestions that are suggested by the invention of hypertext come out through software such as wikis, underlying Wikipedia. The idea of documents that anyone can add to, edit, change, and so on. It becomes core to this idea of the network as a potentially democratic space. And it's something that allows for an understanding of text and code as operating together at the same time. But this idea of the network is not something that emerges solely with ARPANET, one of the precursors to the internet, and with hypertext. It's a kind of object that emerges historically first in, or as far as I understand it, historically first in a particular mathematical problem. Königsberg was a city then in Germany, now in Russia. The mathematician Leonhard Euler was asked on a kind of whim to work out whether it was possible for citizens of Königsberg to walk across the city, crossing each of the city's bridges only once. So the problem was, could you find a route through the city by which you could have a nice stroll, but only cross each of these bridges once? That was the question posed to him. In order to solve this problem, Euler had to invent a new form of mathematics that traced connections between things. And this form of mathematics, he developed it. It became quite substantially worked by him at this point, but for around 150 years was then kind of just laid dormant in the documents that he produced around it. Can anyone work out whether it's possible or not? No, unfortunately not. But it was an interesting way of posing a mathematical problem based around the idea of kind of pleasure in the city. So that was the basic kind of mathematical technique for working out aspects of a network. Other approaches came from the social sciences to look at the way in which networks are structured in society and what the meaning of networks are. So one of the first ideas around the network in social forms, that is, the networks that exist latently and implicitly in society. Georg Simmel proposed the basic, the fundamental unit of a society is not your institutions, your social formations, such as clubs, families, associations, companies, and so on. But it was the things that those organisations embedded, that is, who knew each other, who spoke to each other, who worked together, who were friends, and so on. And this he called a pure sociology, that you can extract from these social formations and make a diagram of society. So you see, a lot of these kind of questions are based, provide the basis for what we now think of as social media, the innovation of social media, that is, to be able to provide a graph of your contacts and provide a mechanism for your contacts. But from Simmel's perspective, from the perspective of others, what social media does is simply to provide a centralized service for this maintenance of your social network. This work was later taken up by Jacob Marino, who's a psychoanalyst who differed from Freud in that he was interested in groups and collectives rather than simply the problems of the individual, as he saw it. So what he did was to look at the way in which people interacted and how the problems that he saw as addressable by psychoanalysis could be understood in relationship to the kinds of contacts they had with other humans. So, for instance, one famous case He looked at rates of absconsion from a girls' home, a girls' school in New York, to look at the way in which, by mapping the networks of friendships amongst the girls in the school, one could apparently predict those who would run away and those who would successfully stay through their period of education. His argument was that those who had a stable social network were less likely to run away than those who had a more kind of fragmented social network. So what he did was to invent the sociogram, the graph, which I'll show you in a minute, the graph of social relations in order to diagram this. It was also taken up in anthropology, where people would map the social structures of, say, a village or of a society, or of religious behaviours in the 1930s to 40s. And most famously, perhaps, this American or North American scientist Stanley Milgram developed his theory of 6 degrees of separation. Has anyone heard of Milgram? Okay. So Milgram's idea was to do, and one of his kind of methodological innovations is to look at ways of experimenting with society live. So rather than withdraw from society to study small units of operation, or to just simply observe, what he did was to make things happen and within society in different ways, and then see what people's responses were. So his theory was that anyone in the world would be able to connect, or what he wanted to find out was how closely connected is the world. So what he did was to send letters through people and ask them to get a letter to a certain other named person who they didn't know, and it would be anyone in the world. And so what he found was that he was able to get these letters passed from one person to another on the basis of intuition or hunch of people who would be more likely to know that person. Gradually, these letters were sent, and they were sent by post or hand to hand. And as each person received the letter, they were asked to pass it on to a person who was more likely to know the person to whom it was addressed. So the techniques that people used were, okay, I've been given a letter addressed to someone in another country. I don't know who they are, but I know someone in a nearby country. I'll send it to them. That person would then send it to someone they knew who perhaps lived in the same country, and that person may send it to someone who lived perhaps in the same city, or perhaps was of a similar kind of professional activity, or might live in the same kind of street as the person. Gradually, the differences between the people were whittled down, and on average, it took most of these letters took around 4, 5, or 6 jumps to reach the addressee. So this was something done internationally, and it was done through many different social differentiators. But this is something that Milgram proposed as a kind of as a method of live experiment on society or in society, and something that was kind of spectacular and entertaining to take part in. But also, the finding was that the world was much more densely interconnected than previously imagined. So again, this idea of networks and what we'll find later as weak ties. So Sybil's one of the basic texts for the founding of sociology as a discipline is this idea that you can extract social relations into a kind of abstract schema that can then stand in for what the social is. So Sybil's basic idea was that you could state a social relation based on who was in contact with other people. And this linked to the development of similar kinds of description in mathematics, called graph theory, that's proposed, if we think back to Baran's diagram of nodes and links, or nodes and vertices, to mapping connections between objects, between people, and so on. If you think, for instance, of a diagram of a train system, you can think of a map of the train network, but you can also think of the timetable that expresses that map differently. So expresses that map in terms of time. So as these kind of social theorists, psychoanalysts, anthropologists worked on this problem in their fields, mathematics also developed in order to express these kinds of objects. So the first diagram of the social form expressed as a graph was Marino's work in the 1930s, where he shows the interconnections between people who know each other. So in this graph, this distance or that distance, there are different lengths, but the length doesn't mean anything. It's simply the matter of connection and the direction of the connection. This matrix can also be, this graph rather, can also be expressed in different ways. Just like a map of train lines can be expressed as a timetable, which is effectively a matrix. It can also be expressed in these terms. So does Mills know Bryant? No. But does Mills know, well, Mills does know Mills, that's true. Mills know Gazowski? Yes. And Nutting, let's see, where's there are two? Yeah. Okay, so these describe bivalent relations. So where both parts of a pair know each other. Okay, so network analysis then moves once the internet and other kinds of networks, for instance the telephone network, start to overlay society, start to reconstitute society. There's an increase in the idea that the network is somehow potent and worth investigating. So one of the things that becomes apparent, and that was kind of there in Marino's work and in Simmel's work, was this idea that people were defined by their connections, who they could speak to, who their friends were, who their family was, but also by this other kind of penumbra of what became known as weak ties. So people you know, people you may say hello to, but you don't necessarily know them extremely well. But this set of weak ties was something that allowed you to prosper in society. So the more people you knew incidentally, the more you were able to feel secure and engaged and involved in the social formation you were part of. So this idea became important. Theorists such as Duncan Watts and Mark Granovetter in the 1990s were able to kind of crystallize it in both in sociological and mathematical terms. But also what was happening at that time was that people started to look at what were called scale-free phenomena. And so this is a kind of mathematics that emerges in the 1960s from what became known as chaos theory or fractal mathematics. Is everyone familiar with these terms? They're kind of pop mathematics in a sense. The idea that you can have phenomena that occur in a scale-free way means that you have the same mathematical pattern occurring at different scales. So if you look at a classic fractal, it's the same pattern repeating at small scales and large scales. So this was argued as being characteristic of the network. So just as the network is composed, if we think of the World Wide Web, the network is composed of documents that are composed of links. These documents make up sites that are also composed of links. And these sites are linked together by links that have a recursive structure. So that there are links of links to links to links to links. And this is what creates the so-called scale-free factor, that the thing looks the same, whatever degree of zoom you look into it at. Okay, one of the key theorists of this, the kind of mathematics or physics of scale-free networks is Barabasi, a Hungarian mathematician now based in the US. If we've got time, I'm going to come back and show you this part of this film, just to give you. Okay, I think we'll go back to this film because I think it's more useful than what I can say.
And Watts were pioneering small worlds, another scientist would look at the problem from a different angle. For Hungarian physicist Laszlo Barabasi, understanding networks held the promise of predicting the future. His inspiration came from a classic work of science fiction, Isaac Asimov's Foundation.
I have said the Empire will lie in ruins within the next century.
Asimov's Foundation centers on a mathematician with the power of prediction. But Barabasi had identified a flaw in the story.
I started thinking, what is that I could do to predict the future? I realized that what is missing from Asimov's thinking is the network, the structure and the behavior of the network. Because events are never isolated. They depend on each other. They interact with each other. So we need to understand how they interact.
To understand these interactions, Barabasi needed a network that had been thoroughly mapped.
The major problem was that the data was incredibly difficult to find.
But then everything changed. It was the early 90s, and the World Wide Web was exploding in popularity. Here was a huge network he could map by tracing the links between web pages. No one directed the growth of the web. Anyone could put up a site and link to wherever they liked. So the expectation was that the structure would be entirely random.
If the World Wide Web to be a random network, then the distribution of the links follows a bell curve. I would find something similar to this.
In a bell curve, there are few extremes. Most web pages would be grouped in the middle, having the same number of links. But what he discovered was different. The web links were not evenly spread. Most pages had very few links, but there were some with a huge number of connections.
We found a few web pages that had thousands of links pointing to them. And these were the hubs.
It was completely new, completely unexpected. First, we did not know what to do with them.
This was no random world. It seemed to have an organizing principle based around hubs. In these early days of the web, long before the familiar super sites of today had emerged, Barabasi's study had glimpsed the future.
It predicted the potential for the existence of huge hubs, like Amazon and Google and Yahoo turned out to be.
Barabasi's hunch was that behind this pattern there may be a deeper truth lurking. By coincidence, Watts had just published his paper on the small world of Hollywood actors. Barabasi wondered if there could be hubs there too.
I got an email from Laszlo Barabasi, and he said, would I mind sharing some of the data?
So we took the data set and we interpreted, just like the World Wide Web, as a map. And we asked the question, how many links each actor has. We saw exactly the same pattern as we observed earlier on the World Wide Web. There were many actors that had only a few links to other actors. There were a few major hubs, however.
Though it was right in front of them, Watson Strogarts had missed a second great discovery.
The funny thing is, we didn't really look. And so we had all this data looking, staring us in the face, and I never thought to actually plot the distribution.
Finding hubs in Hollywood was a major breakthrough. It suggested that networks didn't just grow accidentally. They evolved according to some pattern. And if so, hubs should be everywhere. And sure enough, Barabashi found hub networks in transportation routes, in computer chips, and within the human cell.
I kept thinking, how is it possible? Because they cannot be more different in the scope, in domain, and their nature. The more I thought about it, more I realized that there must be a simple explanation for that. Because these are such a different systems that the only way they could be similar to each other is that there is one simple law that describes the structure of all of them.
And he discovered that simple equation that describes our complex, interconnected world.
PK equal K to the minus gamma. That is the formula.
Barabashi's equation not only showed that hubs were inevitable, it can also predict the number of hubs in any given network. Here was the secret behind almost every network. The structure that nature uses to spin its webs. And once it could be seen, it revealed networks have peculiar strengths and weaknesses, with implications for all of us.
There are hundreds and thousands and potentially millions of errors in my cell, and yet I don't even notice. The internet can work even when hundreds of its routers are not functional. If you remove the small nodes, it does not matter. The network will shrink but will not fall apart. But there is a price you pay for this extreme robustness. If you remove the hubs, the system will fall apart.
We live in a connected world. Networks dominate our economy, our environment, and our society. Our health depends on them, and yet we barely notice their presence. Through random links or hubs, the world is made small, allowing everything to travel far and fast on the network. This can be good news or totally devastating. It depends on what's spreading on the network. In 2000, a virus, the I Love You bug, took just hours to spread through the world's computer networks.
And penetrated the CIA, the Pentagon, and the House Department.
One of the scientists tracking the virus was physicist Sandro Vespignani. He was puzzled by its rapid spread and by its resilience. Even though software to kill the bug was released within a day, it survived for months.
Japan came back from a week-long holiday to find a love bug still lurking in many people's computers.
The quicker is the disease at the beginning, and the quicker it should die out from the system. And actually, this was not the case. We were really puzzled by this fact that the I Love You virus was lingering in the wild.
Like many scientists, Vespignani assumed that viruses spread at random.
We were, trying a few things, and actually something at a certain point that was struck by a paper.
It was Barabashi's study, showing the internet had a predictable structure.
When I saw that image of the internet, I thought that was the pattern that I had to include in the model in order to get a realistic description of what was happening with computer viruses.
The virus used network structure to spread unstoppably through the hubs and hide in the far reaches on the net. And as Vespignani learned, this had alarming implications far beyond the internet.
I got a question. These results would apply to human sexually transmitted diseases. Well, no way. It was clearly not applicable in my mind because the internet is different from the web of sexual relation. I was wrong.
Champion basketballer Wilt Chamberlain claimed he had sex with 20,000 women, an average of 1.9 couplings per day over his adult life.
Wilt was almost unstoppable.
Even allowing for some exaggeration, he was clearly a hub in the human sexual network.
There are few records left for Wilt to tilt.
A Swedish study of sexual behavior showed most people had only a few partners, but a handful had hundreds. The web of sexual relations looked exactly like the internet. It was dominated by a few hubs. And just like I Love You, this meant that if a virus entered the network, it would be almost impossible to remove.
So suddenly, from one day to another, what we were doing in the computer virus area was important for human diseases.
Vespignani's research helps us to understand the resilience of HIV. Despite 2 decades and billions of dollars in prevention programs, the virus is entering an explosive new era of growth. His findings also help explain the failure of early awareness campaigns to prevent the spread of the disease. These were aimed at the general public long before the significance of hubs were recognized. Vespignani's group is now modeling the intersection of global transport networks and disease. They can predict the spread of a new flu virus. Airline networks are dominated by a few major airports. Once an infected person...
Okay, so you can see that this idea of the network becomes an explanatory technique for many different kinds of phenomena. It's the kind of underlying principle of the idea of connection becoming significant in multiple different domains, ranging from the construction of the cell to analysis of